This podcast is sponsored by Teens and Youth in Leadership, CYIL Africa, an organization that is committed to raising generations of young leaders across Africa. Our programs include leadership education, leadership fellowship, research training, webinars, and conferences. Stay informed of our programs by following us on LinkedIn at CYIL and at CYIL Africa on Instagram.
Hello, my name is Israel Idari. I'm a social scientist and a pragmatist. As a social scientist, my research is focused on understanding how youth develop leadership to make social change within their communities and immediate environment. I'd like to invite you to this podcast where I interview and have conversations with scholars and practitioners on their perspective on leadership, followership, and social change. I hope you truly learn from this podcast. Have fun. Hi, Dr. Riggio.
Hi.
Good to have you again.
Yeah, well, I'm glad to be back with you and talking with you.
So if you don't already know, Dr. Riggio is a renowned industrial organizational scholar and a professor at one of the top universities in the United States. All right, so today I'm not talking about leadership. I want to talk about followership with you. And you have considerable wealth of experiences and you have dedicated so many years in doing followership research. What's actually inspired you to starting this followership research?
Yeah, so gosh, about 20 years ago, I was at a leadership conference and was there with Mary Ulbein, who you know her name because she has done a lot in followership. And we started talking about how the followers have been neglected in the study of leadership. And at that time, I said, yeah, we should do something about that. And a couple of years later, I had the opportunity to host a conference on followership here at Claremont McKenna College. And that led to the book publication, The Art of Followership, and started the whole thing going. So I think we're 20 years later now, we're still not giving enough attention to followers, both in terms of the research that's done on leadership and followership, but also in terms of the practice of leadership. I think leaders don't give enough attention to followers, to followership, to understanding how important followers are to the leadership equation, right? So one of the things I think that there's been a changing definition of leadership. The traditional definition of leadership says, the leader sort of spurs followers to action. And so it begins with the leaders and ends kind of with the followers' action. And I think that a better definition is the one that we're currently sort of promoting, and that's that leaders and followers together co-construct. They construct leadership. You can't have leadership without the followers and without the leader, and so they have to work together. And we also know that leaders sometimes follow and followers sometimes lead, so it's a reciprocal relationship. So if we want to talk about like the importance of why leaders should pay more attention to followers, there's a saying, and I tried to look up who created this saying, and they didn't have somebody, but it's called "the people make the place." And it's this idea that in organizations, it's all about the people and the culture, and that that a collective, an organization, a movement doesn't exist without the people. And if we sort of look at that from a leadership lens, then we have leaders and followers all together, and combined, they make the place, they make the culture happen. So part of this is leaders need to consider, how do you think about your followers and how do you think about their role and their responsibilities in co-creating the leadership? So there's this construct of implicit follower theories. So we have implicit leadership theories. We all think, what does an ideal leader look like? What's a bad leader look like? and we have these implicit ideas, so a good leader is, you know, if I'm a worker, I think a good leader supports me. He's got a little bit of empathy. He knows what he's doing, so I have this implicit idea. Well, leaders also have these implicit theories about their followers. And so a very traditional, I would say, not a very sophisticated leader would say, well, my followers, I give them commands and they behave, right? Which is,
Mhm.
sort of very traditional top-down leadership. That's probably not the right mindset for a really good leader. So I think that leaders need to think about their implicit idea about followers. What do they want their ideal followers to look like? And then help to select those kinds of people for your team, help develop those kinds of qualities and characteristics in your followers, and have that really good idea of what a good follower looks like, and that should drive things. And I think that that's going to be better, right?
Mhm.
The other thing too is we know that employees, that followers want to have a voice, they want to have an impact. If we look at all the leadership theories, most of the more modern theories of leadership say, well, you need to have congruence, alignment between what the leader thinks the collective should be doing, the team should be doing, and the followers should be on board with that. So they should all be saying, if they're working at Starbucks, they should all say, we want to have a great customer experience. We want to produce quality beverages, whatever. And they should all be aligned on that. And that's going to create a good organizational culture. But you've got to consider, what do the followers think? In a high-tech creative organization, the great ideas don't always come from the leader. They sometimes come from the
Mhm.
followers, right?
Yeah.
They have, and so a good leader would solicit ideas from followers and say, and have that mindset that the followers might have the solution to our problem. They may come up with a new technique, a new product, whatever. So I think that it's really critically important that leaders think about their followers in a very positive way. What do you want your ideal followers to look like?
Yeah, thank you. When you started 20 years ago, up until now, do you think there's any development in how people perceive followers or the study of followership?
Okay, so I could go back to that 20 plus years ago, and one of the arguments that came up, and this is among the scholars who were studying followers and followership, and they said, is that the right term? It's got such a negative connotation. And I remember a couple of us saying, well, let's just use the term and keep using the term, and maybe it will diminish that negativity. And I think it's diminished a little bit. I think if you go kind of out in popular, everybody wants to be a leader, nobody really wants to be
Mhm.
labeled a follower. But
Mhm.
at least in the literature, if you pull down a leadership article from today and you look at it 20 years ago, you're going to see a change in the labeling. So if you go back 30 years, it's going to say leader or manager and subordinate. And now it's going to say, more modern, it's going to say leader and follower. So I think we're making some inroads.
Mhm.
But I think that's why we want to get the word out to more practitioners about the importance of followers and followership. And you've attended the Global Followership Conference, which is really trying to promote that. And there's now a number of practitioners, Ira Chaliff, but there's a whole lot of folks like that who are working in follower development, although they may not call it that. They may call it, team development or whatever, but they're really working on trying to get a better recognition of the role that followers play in leadership.
Do you think it's helpful for organizations to have balance of power in the sense that leaders have the same power to followers and followers have the same power to their leaders?
Well, I think it depends on the organization, and it
Mhm.
depends on, the particular team or the particular situation. And that's the third part, context matters. So
Mhm.
in a particular context, if the leader really has a lot of knowledge, direction, they're leading a team of not very experienced people, then the leader's going to play a larger role. If the followers are very experienced and they really know what they're doing, then it makes sense to listen to them. I remember a woman came to me and she was an engineer and she was well versed in this sort of state of the art technology for the kind of engineering work that she was doing. And she worked under this leader who was very, I guess, technophobic. He didn't, he wanted the old technology and he thought the old technology was better. And she had a very difficult time. That's why she came to me. And she said, I can do the work better with the new technology, and I've shown him this, but he treats me badly. He won't take on the new technology. Well, the problem was not her, the problem was him, right? She demonstrated that she could do the work better, but he was resistant. So I think that's a good example of, sort of a leader who isn't going to do well because he doesn't consider that the follower's capacity. So I think it depends on the situation and all, but for the most part, you're going to have a better collective if leaders and followers work together and, work through problems together rather than just traditional top down. The other side is you don't want the followers to be going off on tangents and doing their own thing. So that you have to have alignment.
Yeah. Now, based on your observation over the years, what do you think are the barriers for leaders recognizing followers? I could think some of the leaders may feel insecure,
Yeah. Yeah, I read a paper recently on leaders being jealous of their followers, right? So the follower comes up with a great idea, strategy, and actually that example might be partly, kind of a jealousy thing. So yeah, I mean, I think that's an issue. I think that's a problem. I mean, I think part of the issue is we've sort of put leaders front and center, put them up on pedestals a lot of times. And then I think what happens is the leaders start to think they really are sort of better than they really are. And so they may then be less open to followers' input. But we know if that people, like I said, people want to have a voice in the organization. They want to feel a sense of efficacy, like my work matters. And so I think leaders need to recognize that. And that's like a fundamental need. Leaders need to appreciate the people they work for, work with. They need to appreciate the contributions of team members. And, these are all good leadership practices that we've talked about for decades, right?
Yeah. So, in terms of followership behaviors, what are some of the types of followership behaviors that you think are most prominent in organizations these days?
So there has been some work on this, but it's still kind of in its early stages. And most of the known research on followership talks about typologies of followers. And so we can go to, Robert Kelly, and he said, there's sort of two dimensions. Is you want sort of followers who are thinking and who are engaged, and you want followers who are thinking and engaged and active. And then there's the passive active dimension, and there's the sort of high critical thinking and low, no thinking, right, or low thinking. And so he talks about the ideal followers being those ones who are active and who are also sort of cognitively engaged. Ira Chaleff talks about, in his typologies, followers who support the leader, but followers who are willing to challenge and willing to stand up to their leaders. And that becomes really important when the leader is going off the rails, is going in the wrong direction. The followers have to feel empowered enough, confident enough to say to the leader, hey, you're taking us in the wrong direction, or you're about to make a mistake. And, now Chaleff is talking about the only way to stop a bad leader is the followers have to do it. Or what's happening is some of the followers are supporting the bad leadership and going along with it. And then that's what's causing the problem. Nobody willing to stand up to the bad leader.
Yeah. So. At the last International Leadership Association conference in Chicago, I attended a session where the speaker was teaching on adaptive followership. Now, one of the fears that many leadership scholars may have, especially those who haven't totally aligned with the term followership, may be that, many people will begin bringing concepts that is associated to leadership. For example, someone bringing up transformational followership. How do you think we can create this balance of constructs, now that followership is becoming a thing?
Yeah. I think you're getting back to the idea of our leaders going to be threatened by this, or I think that probably in most instances isn't a real concern. A leader needs to understand. I mean, one of the things that we're talking about right now is just changing that mindset. So leaders need to, realize that the people are important, the people they're leading are important, their ideas are important, that they have capacity, and be more open to that and not see it as threatening, right? See it as, part of the balance. So there's all this research now and talk about leader humility. And I think that's the maybe the wrong term to use. But let me explain what they mean by leader humility. And I've known some really accomplished high-level leaders who I think have this kind of humility, but their humility isn't like a lack of confidence in their own ability. It's knowing that they don't have all the answers, and that they're open and willing to consult with followers, with outside experts, with people external to the organization to help them come to good decisions, or to co-develop good decisions. And so the humility is really the willingness to listen to other people, to say, I don't know, I don't have all the answers. I think where a leader gets potentially on the wrong path is when they really believe they have all the answers, they know the right way to do things. It's my way or the highway. Mm-hmm. And that's a recipe for, I think, for disaster in a leadership situation.
Yeah. So how do you think we can curb toxic followership?
Toxic followership. Okay. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think that's where the leader has to put up guardrails, just the same way that we say when we have a toxic leader, the followers need to be the guardrails. Mm-hmm. I think the leader needs to implement some kinds of guardrails to keep the followers from doing things that are damaging to the goals, to the collective. And I have a colleague who's a consultant, and we've worked together on things, and he talks about leader discipline. And when he first talked about that, leaders disciplining, right? And at first my reaction was kind of negative. That sounds very, very sort of, dark and
yeah.
Like the,
carrot and stick.
The teacher with the with the ruler or whatever. But I understand what he's saying is, he says the leader sometimes has to make hard decisions and has to tell followers, no, we can't do this for these reasons. And I think that you've got to just be open about that. And then I think sometimes, it's obvious that leaders are going to have followers who just are not going to do the right thing. And you need to have that discipline to say, hey, it's you need to leave this organization, or you need to leave this team. So I don't want to sugarcoat this idea that, leaders should just be totally open to followers. There are times where you need to say, it's time for you to move on, or we can't have you, in this role anymore, whatever. So clearly leaders have to deal with the toxic followers in the same way that followers have to be able to stand up to their leaders and deal with leaders when they're doing the wrong thing. The difference is the power differential. It's much easier for the leader to do it than the low power followers. And so that's why Ira Chaloff's book is called The Courageous Follower, because they need to have the courage to stand up. It takes a lot of courage sometimes to stand up to a leader.
Mm-hmm. I think it was 2 years ago, myself and Eric Hoffman did a research on how people perceive followership. And one of our findings from that research was that many times when followers see that their leaders are not doing what they're supposed to do, they begin to form a network. And that's called network analysis, where they begin to, want to do things themselves. They begin to hold meetings, and ultimately they become more powerful than the leader. So how do you think leaders can make sure that followers do not have this much power?
Well, I mean, I think that that in some of those instances, the leader's not doing the
Yeah,
leader's
that's obs-
job, which is to
mm,
monitor what's going on, to see what's happening within their team. That
mhm.
there's kind of a there's kind of a like a revolution going on, or I want to say mutiny, but they're going in the wrong direction. And I think, so the leader first has to say, okay, is this aligned with where we should be going, and then bring all of it together. I think
Mm,
that's a critical thing. But I've seen that too. I mean, so we have a student-led organization that we monitor here at the college, and sometimes they go off the rails a little bit.
yeah.
They start to lead in a direction that's inconsistent with the goals of our institute here and what we're trying to do. And we allow them to lead this organization because it's a student-led organization. But every once in a while, we have to sort of draw them back in.
Mm,
And so, I see times where they start to get off of the mission. And I think you see this a lot in nonprofit organizations. Some group, goes off into a different direction, and it's up to the leaders to draw them back in. I'm on a couple nonprofit boards, and one of the issues with one of the organizations was we were having mission creep. They were going into different directions and doing some different things,
mm,
and we had to pull them back. And with that idea of discipline, in one instance, we had to take the person who essentially was the chief operating officer of the nonprofit, the executive, and we had to say, it's time for you to leave the organization because you're
mm,
you're consistently taking this in a direction that the board doesn't believe is the right direction. And
mm,
so that person left, and it was a loss and it was difficult, but they just would not align. They were not aligned with the purpose of the organization.
mm. Wow. That's interesting because I lead a nonprofit and I'm just imagining my board member saying, Israel, we are not satisfied with what you're doing. You're going off the radar.
Yeah, yeah. Sometimes happens. I mean, it wasn't that this individual was not performing. They were performing well, but they were neglecting the main core mission of the
Mm,
organization. They were engaged in side projects the side projects were becoming more important than the main purpose.
yeah.
And that's where we said, no, this is
Mm,
not good.
mm. So my final question, I know there was a time we had a conversation outside this podcast where you mentioned about the implicit peer theories.
Oh yeah,
Yeah. Do you want to just, give
I can mention that. So we think about how do followers think about leaders, which is the implicit leader theory. We think about how do leaders think about their followers. That's the implicit followership theory. And Kevin Lowe and I started talking about, well, how do followers think about their teammates? And so
Mm,
it might, we call it implicit peer theory. It could be implicit, theory of your teammate, but
yeah.
it's this idea of what's the ideal person you want to work with on a team
Mm,
if you're at the same sort of
level.
hierarchical level in
Mm,
the organization. One of the difficulties with the sort of leader follower analyses that we do is there's power dynamics and there's roles. And you can't leave the power dynamics and the roles out of the equation when you start studying leadership and followership.
mm,
And so it creates a complexity. I think what we're thinking with the peer theory, the implicit peer theory, is like, who do I want on my team? So you could think of a startup organization, and when they begin, they're peers. So the founders of the organization, and maybe one guy is the tech guy, and the other guy is the management guy, and the other guy is the get it done,
mhm,
And so and initially they're all sort of peers and they're working together. Well, what's going to happen is that organization starts to grow, and is they're going to start to put layers in there, and they're going to have more defined roles and a power structure and all of that. what we're hoping to do, I think, with that implicit peer theory is to strengthen the follower to follower relationship in organizations. So, and realize that sometimes a mismatch of uh, team members, of followers, perceptions of one another might cause a disruption in the performance or might cause lower performance. So I think
Mm.
that's kind of where we're going with that.
Yeah.
And it's still in its early stages.
Yeah. Yeah.
So,
Well, thanks for sharing. My
yeah.
final question: if there is any research that the field of followership should promote now, if there is any discourse on followership that should be promoted now, what do you think that should be?
I think the big issue right now, and one of the things that I think I'm kind of promoting, and I know Mary Bean and Melissa Karsten, and some of the people who are really on the cutting edge of research on followership, is we've got to change that definition of leadership from something that leaders do to something that leaders and followers, do together. And that's what, and we're calling it the co-creation perspective, is that together, leaders and followers create leadership. And if we change that definition, it's going to put a greater spotlight on the followers, I think. Right now, we talk about there's a classic idea, the romance of leadership. We
Mhm.
give leaders lots more credit than probably they deserve. We pay high-level CEOs salaries that are out of, they're getting more than they should get in terms of their contribution to the organization. Although, I know that's controversial and people will argue with me or whatever, but we're talking about that rising differential between the lower level people and the
Mhm.
people at the top. And so I think that's part of this romance of leadership, and we need to tamp that down, and we need to start thinking about it's leading to all kinds of inequities in organizations, inequities in economic terms, in terms of the people who have more money and people who are struggling.
Mhm. Well, thank you so much. Thank you
Okay,
for
Israel, enjoyed
your
our
thoughts.
conversation.
Same here.
Okay.
Thank you for listening to the Future of Leadership podcast today. If you are here to kindly share, subscribe, leave a review, and follow us across our social media platforms, including Facebook, LinkedIn, and Instagram, all at TYIL. See you in the next episode.